For as long as I can remember, I've always been drawn to the old black and white monster horror movies. I remember as a kid going to the public library and getting a book about the movie The Wolfman. The images of the fur on Lon Chaney's face as he portrayed the Wolfman scared me. It was a sense of curiosity that kept me looking, and those thoughts turned to wonder as I wondered how these effects were done. Was it makeup? Was he really the Wolfman? It really opened up a new genre of horror monster movies to me that had been terrorizing generations before. Welcome to the Poison Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Cody Gregory, and today we're looking at the classic horror movie Monsters. The Universal Studios Monster Universe is a shared fictional universe that revolves around a group of iconic monsters from classic horror films and produced by Universal Studios between the 1920s and 50s, I do believe. These monsters include Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the creature from the Black Lagoon, amongst a whole wide range of others. The Universal Monsters universe began with the release of the film Dracula in 1931 and continued with other films such as Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Invisible Man, and of course the Wolfman. The characters became cultural icons and have been reimagined and adapted over and over and over again. If I had to choose, I'd say my favorite of these classic monsters is Frankenstein. I even have a Boris Karloff inspired tattoo of Frankenstein on my thigh. I read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein when I was young. For a novel written in the 1800s, it left a lasting impression on me as a kid in the 90s. Frankenstein was written during the summer of 1816, while Mary was staying in Geneva, Switzerland with her husband Percy and their friends, including Lord Byron. The group spent much of their time reading ghost stories and discussing scientific ideas, which led Mary to come up with the idea of Frankenstein. The novel was published anonymously in 1818 and was a huge success. The novel was also inspired by Mary's personal life, including the death of her mother and the loss of her own child. Mary's own experiences with grief and loss likely played a significant role in the creation of the character Victor Frankenstein, who was driven to madness by his obsession with creating life. The movie adaptation of Frankenstein with Boris Karloff taking on the role as the monster has to be one of my all-time favorites, hands down. The monster is created by Victor Frankenstein, a brilliant but ambitious scientist who uses his knowledge of science to create a living being from the remains of dead bodies. However, he is horrified by the monster's appearance and abandons him, leaving the monster to fend for himself. The monster, who is intelligent and sensitive, struggles to find his place in the world and ultimately seeks revenge against his creator for abandoning him. The question of whether the Frankenstein's monster was evil is a matter of interpretation, and opinion on this varies widely. In Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, the monster is initially portrayed as sympathetic and misunderstood, who is rejected by and ostracized by society. However, the monster's experiences of loneliness and rejection eventually turns him bitter and vengeful, and he commits several acts of violence, including killing several characters. Some readers interpret these actions as evidence of the monster's inherent evil, while others see them as a tragic result of the way he was treated by society. No matter what your take, I think we can all agree that Boris Karloff brought this character to life and solidified Frankenstein into cinematic history.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
The Boris Karloff Frankenstein movie was released in 1931 and it was directed by James Whale. A sequel came out in 1935, also directed by James Whale, called The Bride of Frankenstein, that came out in 1935. And in 1939, The Son of Frankenstein came out, also starring Boris Karloff. In 1957, The Curse of Frankenstein was released. This was starring Peter Cushing as Victor Frankenstein and Christopher Lee as the monster. This film is part of the Hammer Horror Frankenstein series. And of course you've got Young Frankenstein, released in 1974, directed by Mel Brooks and starring Gene Wilder as Victor Frankenstein. And you have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1994, directed by Kenneth Branagh and starring Robert De Niro as the monster, and Branagh as Victor Frankenstein. Of course, these are just a few examples of the many movies that can be found about Frankenstein.
Van Helsing, Now that you have learned what you have learned, it would be well for you to return to your own country.
I prefer to remain and protect those whom you would destroy.
You are too late. My blood now flows through her veins. She will live through the centuries to come, as I have lived.
Should you escape us, Dracula, we know how to save Miss Mina's soul, if not her life.
Second on my list for these classic horror movie monsters is Dracula. Bram Stoker's Dracula is a gothic horror novel published in 1897. The story is told through a series of journal entries, letters, and other documents that detail the experiences of several characters as they encounter and try to defeat the infamous vampire, Count Dracula. The novel begins with Jonathan Harker, a young English solicitor traveling to Transylvania to assist Count Dracula with a real estate transaction in England. However, Harker soon realizes that the Count is not what he seems and is actually a vampire. Harker becomes a prisoner of Dracula's castle, but he eventually manages to escape and return to England. Meanwhile, back in England, Harker's fiancée Mina and her friend Lucy are courted by two suitors, Dr. John Sayward and Quincy Morris, as well as the mysterious Count Dracula. Lucy becomes ill and eventually dies, only to rise as a vampire herself. Dr. Sayward enlists the help of Dutch doctor Van Helsing to try and save Lucy and later defeat Dracula. As Dracula makes his way to England, the group of characters becomes aware of his plans and works together to stop him. They discover that Dracula is vulnerable to sunlight, garlic, and a wooden stake through the heart. In a climactic battle, the group succeeds in destroying Dracula and saving Mina, who has also become a target of the vampire. The novel ends with the characters vowing to keep the events of the story secret and to destroy any evidence of Dracula's existence in order to prevent the spread of his evil influence. There have been many movies made about Dracula over the years, ranging from faithful adaptations of Bram Stoker's novel to more loose interpretations. You can go as far back as 1922 with the German film Nosferatu, which is an unauthorized adaptation of Stoker's novel, with the character of Count Dracula renamed Count Orlok. It is considered a classic of the horror genre and features an iconic performance by Max Schreck as the vampire. And in 1931, Dracula, directed by Todd Browning and starring Bela Lugosi as Dracula. This was the first sound adaptation of Stoker's novel. It set the standard for many Dracula movies to come and cemented Lugosi's portrayal of the character as one of the most memorable. The black and white horror just left you unsettled with the way the lighting of his eyes were and his mannerisms and the way he talked. Truly iconic. In 1958, Horror of Dracula was released. This was another Hammer horror film directed by Terence Fisher, starring Christopher Lee as Dracula and Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. It was a commercial success and spawned several sequels, helping to popularize the Dracula character in the 1950s and 60s. And in 1992, one of the most famous, iconic Dracula portrayals came out in Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and starring Gary Oldman as Dracula. It also features a strong cast including Anthony Hopkins, Keanu Reeves, and Winona Ryder. For my generation, definitely an iconic movie, one that I always go back to. And recently in 2014, Dracula Untold was released. This film, directed by Gary Shore, is a loose prequel to Stoker's novel that portrays Dracula, played by Luke Evans, as a tragic hero defending his kingdom against the Ottoman invaders. Kind of taking a real-life history of Vlad the Impaler, the guy who inspired and became Dracula.
Whoever is bitten by a werewolf and lives becomes a werewolf himself.
Oh, quit handing me that. You're just wasting your time.
The wolf bit you, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, he did.
Wear this charm over your heart always.
All right, I'll take it. What's it worth to you? I'll give you...
to show me the wound?
What?
Do you dare to show me the wound?
The 1941 classic, The Wolfman, was directed by George Wagner and starred Lon Chaney Jr. as Lawrence Talbot, a man who becomes a werewolf after being bitten by a creature while visiting his family's estate in Wales. The movie begins with Lawrence returning to his family's estate after spending many years away in America. He meets Gwen, a local girl who works at a nearby antique shop, and they develop a romantic connection. One night, while out walking, they come across a group of gypsies who are performing a ritual involving a wolf's head cane. Lawrence buys the cane from the gypsies and is subsequently attacked by a wolf. He kills the wolf with the cane, but not before being bitten. And as the full moon rises, Lawrence begins to experience strange and terrifying symptoms, including heightened senses and a growing urge to kill. Gwen and Lawrence's father begin to suspect that Lawrence is responsible for a series of gruesome murders that have been occurring in the area. Lawrence himself begins to realize that he is transforming into a werewolf and seeks the help of a psychiatrist to try and cure his affliction. On the next full moon, as it approaches, Lawrence transforms into the Wolfman and goes on a rampage through the town. He is eventually cornered and killed by his father, who uses the wolf's head cane to deliver that fatal blow. The movie ends with Gwen mourning Lawrence's death, and his father looking at the moon and realizing that the Talbot family curse will never be broken. Over the years, there have been a slew of great werewolf movies that have come out, including An American Werewolf in London in 1981, Ginger Snaps, The Curse of the Werewolf, the Underworld series, and just recently the Marvel Werewolf by Night. Most of these movies are phenomenal for their practical effects over CGI, which has been synonymous with the werewolf genre. In my opinion, all these classic horror movies from Universal from the 30s to 40s, 50s, they all still stand the test of time. So when you're looking for a new movie to watch, maybe go back in time. Give them a try. I know I sure love them. Well, that's this episode of the Poison Culture Podcast. I hope it inspired at least one of you guys to watch one of these classic horror films. With only 219 days until Halloween, grab your popcorn and get spooky.